Happy to introduce our second panel. This is a panel of experts and people with an opinion about what's going on in Nigeria. They've studied the issue. They're very concerned. We have very honored to have former Congressman Frank Wolf. He served 17 terms in Virginia. He is the author of the International Religious Freedom Act and a well-known human rights advocate. He has traveled the world going to battle for oppressed people, and his voice is well respected and well heard here on Capitol Hill. He has been adamant about our group, Save the Persecuted Christians, of which I am the executive director, and Stephen Inada's group. He is the director of International Committee on Nigeria, and he will be speaking. We also have Frank Gaffney from the Center for Security Policy, who is also the president and CEO of Save the Persecuted Christians, and a expert on this topic of what is driving violence in Nigeria. We have Piero Tosi from Representative Chris Smith from New Jersey office. He is with the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. We'll take about 3 to 5 minutes from each of you on your concerns for Nigeria. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank the committee, and I want to thank the witnesses for coming so far, and I also want to thank all of you for taking the time to be here. The USERF report that came out a while back makes it clear this is religious persecution. I know you all have copies in the office. Nigeria is the largest country in Africa, 195 million. Some say almost 200 million. In the year 2050, they'll have more people in Nigeria than we will have here in the United States. The conditions are very difficult. Tremendous poverty, corruption, several million in IDP camps, millions more living in villages in very, very, very poor condition. 15,000 Nigerian women and girls have gone to Italy and are being sexually trafficked. Every time you hear a story where a boat sinks in the Mediterranean, it's usually 10 or 15% are from Nigeria. So very, very tough. If you look at the Global Terrorism Index, you'll find that it's the third most dangerous country in the world. First is Afghanistan, and then Iraq, and then Nigeria. Boko Haram has killed more people than ISIS. And not many look at the attention that ISIS has gotten, and Boko Haram has pledged allegiance to ISIS. So then you have the Fulani militants. I was in Nigeria when his village was attacked, Agutu, and they came in helicopters. They had motorized boats. And I talked to an expert the other day who in the area of genocide. And he claims that the scholars say that with regard to Boko Haram, what is taking place in Nigeria is genocide. Clear and simple. So for the first time, we've had people say, and scholars say, it is genocide. I know many of you worked on the Hill when Secretary Kerry made the comment that it was genocide in Iraq with regard to the Christians and Yazidis. Then the Congress passed a resolution. It literally changed everything. So here we have a situation. We have obviously the Holocaust Museum, which we all respect. Never again. Here we have a situation that is genocide with regard to Boko Haram. With regard to the Fulani militants, the experts say it is crimes against humanity, genocidal activity, and perhaps, maybe, but perhaps genocide. So I would hope that Congress and the administration, knowing that on the watch that we're now facing, these people are facing genocide, which we in the West have never allowed to continue. We missed it in Rwanda. We all remember in Rwanda. We missed it in Srebrenica. We missed it in Darfur. Let us not miss it here in Nigeria. 5 years ago, when the Chibok girls were kidnapped, the whole world, and I was very pleased to see it. All elected leaders did hashtag bring back our girls. We were in Jos about 2 years ago, and we spoke to one of the mothers, and they said when they saw that, they were so excited that the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of England, and world leaders were saying, hashtag bring back our girls. And yet I looked this past April, this was the 5th anniversary in April, there were no hashtag bring back their girls. We need to focus on this. And so my request to all of you, particularly to the Congress, but also to the administration, do not allow this to slip away. If the experts, Greg Stanton and others, and Genocide Watch are saying it's genocide, we cannot turn away, because we give millions of dollars to Nigeria. And Bono, the Irish rock star, said a while back, he said, if Nigeria implodes, and many experts believe it is imploding and will implode, but Bono said, if Nigeria implodes, it will be an existential threat to Europe and to the rest of the world. Young girls being sexually trafficked, millions in camps, people living in fear as they go to church, as they move around. Terrorism everywhere you go, from Boko Haram to the Fulanis. I would urge members of Congress and also the administration, please engage on this people and help, and let us do everything we can to see that Leah comes back soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Frank Wolf. Once again, my name is Stephen Enada. I'm Executive Director of International Committee on Nigeria, who actually has facilitated the coming of our witnesses today. International Committee on Nigeria has actually been working on different fronts to make sure the instability in Nigeria and security challenges are appropriately addressed. But after last year ministerial, we took we are the first country, International Committee on Nigeria, under the leadership and advice of Ambassador Sam Brownback, took religious roundtable to Nigeria, and it has been sustained. And the reason is just to bring different religious groups together to discuss issues that confront Nigeria. That's it. A lot of people, because anytime I'm engaging either in Europe or here, the question has been that of moral equivalence. That, okay, these are actually 50-50, and then we begin to see how people will begin to aggregate Muslims, XYZ are killed, Christians are killed. Well, the question is that there is no decency in anybody being killed. And we can't out-argue each other. If any Nigerian is killed, it's a big concern for everybody. So now, on that note, we begin to look at Nigeria's fragility from that perspective. You can see victims here today, and there are many, many more victims. My community in Benue State was attacked and is still being under attack. And now, when you look at Nigeria problem, Nigeria issues is complex. We have religious persecution in Nigeria, social hostility that comes with it. We have economic problem in Nigeria. We have ethnic problems in Nigeria, banditry that also is, to me, is terrorism. You begin to look at that, then you begin to see the two strands of these groups that bedevil Nigeria. Boko Haram actually have committed genocide. Well, I'm looking for people who would say that, look, it's not legally defined yet, but I think if they had killed, like Congressman Frank Wolf has just said a while ago, that if killed more than ISIS, then what is it? They've committed genocide. And then the attacks of Fulani in Nigeria is becoming genocidal. So the problem here is that Nigeria government either is culpable, is helpless. These are issues we should be able to address together as human beings. Humanity calls for empathy, calls for action. And that is also when we are looking at situation whereby United States of America will take a step like it did in Sudan, by sending Senator John Danforth to Sudan as an envoy. If you look at Nigeria, Nigeria has bad neighborhood that actually allowed this Boko Haram, Fulani militant to flourish. Because you look at the Tuareg in Mali, you see other groups in Niger, in Chad, in Cameroon. This is actually existential threat. And these are uncharted territory. So all we are saying now, we need U.S. government to consider sending an envoy to Nigeria and the Lake Chad region to be able to have requisite authority of U.S. government to administer this corridor, to be able to bring terrorism under control in this region. So we are actually committed, and also I would like to warn, if U.S. is trying to protect Africa region, Nigeria should be protected because China flourishes when there is instability. And now China is plundering even Nigeria. So what is happening in Zamfara is actually illegal miners actually coming from China. So these are issues that is important. And I tell you, you look at these people who have come all the way, please and please, this is important. God bless.
Yes, I thought I'd just give a few observations from a congressional staff perspective, from a policy-making perspective. And I think one thing that's very important is to try to get a clear understanding of what forces at work creating instability. And sometimes you have, I think, what I would call convenient narratives that only address part of the issue and then become sort of drivers of policy and don't give one a complete understanding. One convenient narrative is framing the issue as farmer-herdsman conflict or something that's driven by climate change. And that's not to discount that. That is a factor, but that only gives a partial understanding. Yet that narrative is often the way that the instability is framed in Nigeria. I think another convenient narrative is, we hear Boko Haram mentioned a lot. Boko Haram becomes sort of the locus of all extremism. And as long as you have an extremist basket that you can label Boko Haram, you ignore other elements of extremism, such as you talk, for example, the Fulani herdsman issue, another such thing. I'll get to that more in a moment. Boko Haram itself has split. It is now, in fact, maybe the greater threat is the Islamic State West Africa. So it's a bigger problem than just Boko Haram. And then you have this issue, I think it's helpful maybe to talk about Fulani ethno-religious chauvinism. And what is at play, I think, in many ways is not just a Muslim-Christian divide, though that is certainly part of it, as we've heard, but it's more complex and it's broader. It's also a quest really for supremacy, an intra-Muslim quest for supremacy, and even an intra-Sunni one. You do have, though it's not the main thing, you also do have a Sunni-Shia split. In Kaduna and Zamfara, you have Shia that have been attacked also and that are victims here. And generally, my understanding is they are not aggressive towards other communities, but are defensive. But even beyond that, I think here a little bit of historical perspective is important. Islam came to West Africa several centuries ago, and you had a number of groups such as the Kanuri that were Muslim. The Fulani came relatively later, and Stephen, I think, would probably give a greater perspective, but just it is important to give some historical perspective. Usman Dan Fodio brought jihad to what is now Nigeria in the late 18th, early 19th century, and that Fulani drive there supplanted some of the existing Muslim communities, and there is this sort of battle for supremacy within Islam. Sometimes, another convenient narrative is Salafist bad, Sufi good, and that's muddies the complexities. Boko Haram is a Salafist movement. And relatively late. I mean, there's an influence of Saudi Arabia in the 1960s, but the Fulani, and we talk about Usman Dan Fodio, that was basically a Sufi movement, and that narrative of Sufi good, Salafist bad is not quite accurate there. So I think really what we need to see, and it's when we talk about Fulani ethno-religious chauvinism, we can't lump all Fulani. I mean, we just had a presidential election with 2 Fulani presidential candidates, Atiku, the challenger, and Buhari, that. But there are certainly, and I think one question that's very interesting to ask, as we talk about the role of the military and, not taking the problems seriously, one question is, who serves in the highest branches of the military? Who serves in state security there? And what we've seen over the past several years has been a placement of certain Fulani leaders in top positions where they have the ability to impact the security situation in other communities. And oftentimes, these are other Muslim communities as well. The Yoruba, so it's a complex one, certainly. And I think then we also have to look at the role of organizations such as Mieti Allah, the Cattlemen's Association, too, and the influence of religious leaders, religious political leaders. Sometimes the Emir of Kano who's Fulani, has been helpful in that. We would like to see leaders like the Sultan of Sokoto speak more clearly, because I think he could use his influence to help end the violence, and sometimes there's one message that's given to one audience and a different one. So anyway, just in closing, thank you, and thank you so much for the testimony on the first panel, which really does clarify things, and thank you also to co-panelists, and we'll maybe, Frank, if you want to.
I'll just say a few closing words. Piero, thank you very much for your help and the leadership of the Lantos Commission. I am really honored to be part of this. I've learned so much, hardly an expert, but learned so much from being in the room with these wonderful individuals representing their country, really so impressively, as well as being, of course, in the room of one of my mentors, Congressman Frank Wolf, your boss, Congressman Smith, Jim McGovern, his counterpart, are real leaders in this fight, as is Stephen Anata, who has been helping our team at Save the Persecuted Christians see this crisis in Nigeria for what it is, which is really a microcosm of a global horror. And there's no other word to describe it. I think Congressman Wolf touched on it a moment ago when he talked about the Holocaust Memorial. When you think about it, what was done by Adolf Hitler, and what was done, for that matter, by Pol Pot in Cambodia, what was done by Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, what was done by Mao Zedong in communist China. You put them all together, folks, and the number of people whose lives were lost at the hands of those despots, those genocidal maniacs, pales by comparison to the number of lives that are currently being destroyed. Not in every case individuals being killed, but in many cases they are, around the world, simply because they follow Jesus Christ. By some estimates, it's something on the order of 245 million people today are being severely persecuted. Other estimates go as high as 320 million people. What's on display here in Nigeria is just a microcosm of that larger horror. But we think it's so important to help all of us understand that those numbers, huge numbers, in the end come down to individual people whose lives are being so horrifically, in some cases ended, in others simply traumatized. So our purpose is to try to help our leadership understand not only what they do. I mean, there's really never been, I think Congressman Wolf would agree with this, there's never been a U.S. administration that has been more engaged and passionate than the Trump administration about this problem of religious freedom, and specifically what is happening to Christians at this moment. Starting with the President himself, with the Vice President, with the Secretary of State, with the National Security Advisor, with Ambassador Sam Brownback, our Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom. These are all men of great conviction who have been seized with this problem. What we hope to help them do, though, is to find new ways to try to alleviate the suffering, yes, but also bring this sort of persecution to an end. And why I think it's so important to have these men and women talking about what's happening in their country of Nigeria at this particular moment in time is, as we've heard, this is an opportunity to prevent much worse, even genocidal horrors from happening in that country, and take it to the bank, folks, predictably to lots of other parts of Africa and perhaps the wider world beyond, certainly as refugees flee Nigeria, should it come to that. This will be a crisis for a continent that can't cope with those millions of refugees any more than Europe could, the numbers that we saw migrating there. And many Nigerians will go to Europe too, you can be sure, and probably here as well. This is unnecessary. If only a government that understands the problem but has not yet taken the sorts of actions that it could will now become engaged. We've created Save the Persecuted Christians as a vehicle to try to do something that isn't currently being done. There are lots of people, I think some in this room, certainly Congressman Wolf, as a leader to us all, have been working to try to relieve the suffering of the kind you've heard about here today. To get food and medicine and shelter and clothing and refuge to those who are being persecuted. But something more is needed. And interestingly enough, President Trump demonstrated it again in microcosm not so long ago, when on behalf of Pastor Brunson in Turkey, the president held the persecutors accountable and created costs to them for engaging in that persecution. So I just want to say, I think at this moment, whether it's starting with a special envoy or whether it's using foreign aid, which we provide in very large quantities to Nigeria, or foreign military sales, or political legitimacy, or other kinds of benefits that our government bestows on other countries, to begin demonstrating that there are costs to engaging in this kind of persecution, even before it becomes genocidal persecution. And by so doing, we really believe if our government will engage, as our friends have urged them to do, we can prevent what is otherwise certain to happen in Nigeria and Africa and the wider world beyond. And we pray, I hope with your help, that our government will begin taking the sorts of actions that we know it needs to. So with that, let me just say thank you again for being here. Thank you for those of you who are listening to this live streamed or via video, and most especially thank you to Dee Dee and Stephen Anada and Kyle, who've helped put this very important program together, as well as to our guests from Nigeria. Thank you very much.
Maybe just to respond, and on the foreign terrorist organization designation, actually, as Emmanuel Ogebe was the attorney who filed that, so I want to recognize that. And what is very interesting, there was a tremendous amount of resistance from the Hillary Clinton State Department, and Johnny Carson was the Africa Assistant Secretary, to that designation, and that raises a number of issues. But there was a difference. In fact, the Africa Subcommittee held a series of hearings, and there was quite a bit of difference when John Kerry was Secretary of State and Linda Thomas Greenfield was the Africa Assistant Secretary. And the date of the second hearing that the Africa Subcommittee had on the designation of Boko Haram as a foreign terrorist organization, Linda Thomas Greenfield was testifying, and she began her testimony by saying that, I just want to let you know that this morning we designated Boko Haram as a foreign terrorist organization. But no, you're certainly right in noting that, and I think if you have information with regards to Americans who've been attacked, that's something that we would like to receive and to bring up with the administration. So, thank you.
Yes.
Could I just add one point on the role of the government of Nigeria? I think what you've heard here, both at the federal level and at the state level, there is evidence of at least benign neglect, shall we say, or malign neglect of what's happening, if not actual complicity. And this is where I think holding governments accountable is so important, and creating costs. Because otherwise, if it's possible to do that sort of thing with impunity, and I think that's what we've been hearing here today, it will continue.
Well, to cover the other question, the USURF report, and I'm sure many of you have it, says the Nigerian government at the national, state levels continue to tolerate violence and discrimination on the basis of religion or belief and suppress the freedom to manifest religion or belief. And goes on to say the Nigerian federal government failed to implement effective strategies to prevent or stop such violence or hold perpetrators accountable. Boko Haram and the Islamic State, Iraq, Syria, West Africa continue to perpetrate attacks against civilians and the military. Secondly, it's a very tough place to cover. Not many media. There's almost no Western media there. I think they cover Nigeria out of Kenya. So they're covering Chicago out of Washington, D.C. So it's a very tough place. I think the thing is that going forward at this time, and I appreciate the Lantos Commission and I appreciate Congressman Smith's position. He was one of the first, if I recall, to ask that Boko Haram be designated as a terrorist group. This should be a bipartisan issue. There's no political Republican or Democrat issue. We both sides care deeply. This is the time to put together a plan to deal with the issue of where it is at this moment, so that you don't get to the point that Bono is talking about, where it implodes and we see the violence. We did miss it in Darfur. Fortunately, Colin Powell caught it and said something. We did miss in Serbia. He said we missed it. There were, if you read Samantha Power's book, Rwanda, the cables were coming into the State Department and they just ignored it. Let's not miss this, and let's do everything we can to help Leah to return, to bring back the Chibok girls, to make it safe for them in the region. So I think going forward, now, one idea that he said, I think you really need to focus on this like a laser beam. And if you 20 years ago when Colombia was unraveling, there was what they called Plan Colombia, to look at all the aspects of it. I think you basically need a plan Nigeria, Lake Chad region, because not only Nigeria, but as he said, Niger, Chad, Cameroon. The Fulani militants killed, I think, in the Washington Post yesterday, 95. So to look at the whole region, but what do we do in a bipartisan way going forward to make sure that Leah returns, the Chibok girls return, and this does not happen again? And so I hope that Congress will really urge the administration to deal with this, because we have always been, the word genocide carries such power that the administration will be encouraged to really engage on this and work with the Nigerian government, maybe do what he said, appoint a special envoy to be the point person. But we can deal with this thing. We can bring Leah back. We can get the Chibok girls back, and we can deal with it. We can blame what happened in the past. There's things that happen. But going forward, hopefully the Congress, Republicans and Democrats, working with the administration, will do something dramatic to make things better for the people of Nigeria who are suffering so much.